Thank you. It's lovely to be here. Thank you for a lovely introduction, and to I'll hear a little bit later about the work that you're doing in your association. I'm sorry I'm not over in Ireland. I've been to Ireland a number of times, and my dad used to love Irish songs, so he'd always sing to me Irish folk songs when we were driving along. But fortunately, I'm not going to sing anything tonight. That would be a terrible start to the session if I was to start singing Kevin Barry or some of the songs he used to teach me. But I have very fond memories, and we used to come to Ireland when I was a kid. Um, So this session it's one that I don't present that often, actually. So it was really nice to be asked about the work of Martin Buber. My background's in existential therapy. I trained at Regent's College in London as an existential therapist, and then worked in the person-centered field mainly, and have gone on to kind of develop with John McLeod and other colleagues, actually colleagues in Ireland, Marcelo Affinity, who many of you might know, around the pluralistic approach to therapy. But I think for me, probably the most profound and important influence has been the work of Martin Buber. I think probably that's also partly because he was one of the most influential of the Jewish philosophers, and I'm Jewish and not religious, but I think if you know Jewish people, you know that we often see it as a kind of cultural identity. And I guess there's something in the work of Buber that for me resonates at some deep emotional, cultural, maybe transgenerational level about what it means to be a person, and then what it means to be a therapist, and to be, I was going to say an effective therapist, but maybe more what it means to be effective as a therapist and as a human being. And certainly it's been a real guiding light for me, the work of Buber. So I want to talk about that, and I'd like to talk about Buber and his the implications of Buber's work for psychotherapy, and particularly humanistic and integrative approaches. Although I think his work is really relevant, and his concept of the I-thou stance is at the core of many different therapeutic models, or certainly can be, and perhaps draws a dividing line between what is a humanizing form of psychotherapy and one that is perhaps more technical and at worst dehumanizing. So I'm going to share some slides, and hopefully you can see that. Okay, can you see the slides? Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, thanks, Mel.
That's fine.
So I'm mainly going to talk about Buber's book I, Thou, and I, It, and to try and make some sense of it from a psychotherapeutic perspective. Some of you may have read it. It's existential philosophy is never particularly accessible, and I was saying in a workshop recently that some of it, like Heidegger, on a 10-point scale. Heidegger is probably about 9, Sartre is about 9.5. People like Merleau-Ponty are about 15 on a 1 to 10 scale. They're just absolutely impenetrable. Buber's not bad, actually. I was giving him about a 6 or a 7, but a lot of it is actually more poetry than kind of complex. Well, it is complex philosophy, but it's beautiful poetry. And he writes. I'll show you some examples of his writing, which I think is the most beautiful imagery and ethics and philosophy to it. It wasn't the only book that he wrote. The other favourite, for me personally, very influential paper was something in a book called Between Man and Man, which is a paper on dialogue, which again, it's a little bit, some of the language is a bit archaic and a bit obscure, but it is beautiful still. And I think, as with all philosophy, you kind of need to just immerse yourself in it, and if you don't understand everything, that's okay. You know, people like Buber, let alone Heidegger, didn't write for therapists, so they're talking to a different context, and it's understandable for us if we miss large chunks of it, as I certainly do when I read Buber. But as I say, he's a bit easier than some of the others, and he wrote lots about myths. He wrote a beautiful book called Daniel. I've got somewhere down here. I've got my books out. Daniel, which is he's one of his earlier books, and is a very kind of thoughtful reflections, again on kind of dialogue and what it means to dialogue. And it's interesting the roots of Buber's work, because as I'm sure you know, and as I'll talk about, it's a very dialogical, relational philosophy of what it means to be in connection with other human beings. And, you know, we often talk about connection, and we think about the therapeutic relationship, we think about the alliance, we think about being with our clients, we think about engagement. But what does that actually mean to be in engagement, to be in close relationship with another? Malcolm was mentioning some of my work on relational depth, and that's explored that question very much. And I draw on Buber a lot for that book. But this question about what does it mean, you know, if we were to say we're connected now, or we're not connected, what is that? What does it mean to say that there's connection? What does it mean? You know, I'm sure you have sessions with clients when you come out of feeling, yeah, there was a real connection there, but what does it actually mean to say that there is a connection? How can we operationalize it? How can we even perhaps measure it? And it's interesting for me, as I say, I'm not a religious person, but a lot of the work of Buber comes out of a kind of Jewish theological tradition. I mean, he's kind of philosopher, kind of theologian. There's certain large spiritual elements, but if you trace his work back to people like Rosenzweig, there's a book here, The Star Redemption, which I really struggle with. But Franz Rosenzweig, sorry. And it's about our relationship with God. And I think in the Jewish tradition, there's a quite complex relationship with God, and about how we position ourselves in relation to God. In terms of, I think maybe there's a particular emphasis on dialogue. You know, I don't know much about theology, and I want to kind of stick my neck out here, but I think in Judaism, there's a kind of sense in which you talk to God, and sometimes, you know, you might want to argue with God a bit. It was interesting for me, actually, a few years ago, I went back to where my family comes from, in a small town called Berdechev in Ukraine, in where millions of Jews used to live before my grandparents emigrated in 1900s, and then of course there was a Holocaust, so that there's no Jews there left, or very, very small community. But it was interesting for me that finding out actually about some of the background to the context that my grandparents would have been immersed in, and actually there was a very strong Hasidic culture coming from that area, which was a lot about, and there was a very famous rabbi who was basically notorious for arguing with God. That was his shtick, if you like, that he would kind of, you know, he would say, God, why are you giving everyone such a hard time? Do you really have to do this? Look, we're suffering. Why are you making us suffering? So not just kind of accepting it, but questioning it and challenging it. And I think that kind of tradition of talking to God evolved in Buber's work as this question of then how we talk to others. So it was interesting for me that it's got these kind of spiritual roots. And spirituality, as I say, is very alive in Buber's work, in the sense that for him, he's trying to find something which has a kind of spiritual essence. It was interesting, actually, when I was talking to the rabbis in Berdechev, I mean, they were very dismissive of Buber in the sense that they didn't see him as a kind of serious or a real religious scholar. Whereas in philosophy, he's taken very, and humanism, he's taken very seriously. But I think he was really looking for some spiritual essence, and he was looking for some experience of spirituality, some experience of something transcendent in connection, and not in connection with God, but in connection with others. And there's a lovely line, I think in Iron Now, where he says something like, spirit is where the lines of relationship, no, it's something like God is where the extended lines of relation meet. It's like if we brought together all our relationships, all our connections with others, and through that we find God. We don't find God outside of relationship, and some of the existentialists like Kierkegaard had argued, but we find God in our relationships and in our closeness with others. There's a couple of translations of I Am Now. I'm going to go with the Kaufman one. So let me just so just to talk a bit about the book. So I Am Now was written in the 20s. He uses the masculine pronoun. I'll stick with that. And as I was saying, it was kind of steeped in that tradition of Jewish mysticism, Hasidism, a kind of spiritual connection, joy is a large part of that religion. And I just want to start with, just to introduce it and introduce something of what Buber is talking about, is this from very early on in the book. So he says that to human beings, the world is twofold in accordance with their twofold attitude. The attitude of human beings is twofold in accordance with the twofold nature of the primary words which they speak. The primary words are not isolated words, but combined words. The one primary word is the combination I, thou. The other primary word is the combination I, it, wherein, without a change in the primary word, one of the words he or she can replace it. Hence, the I of humans is also twofold. For the I of the primary word I, thou is a different I from the primary word I, it. So what Buber is saying there, and actually, although that might sound a little bit of sophistry perhaps, or a bit obscure, is actually a statement of something which kind of initiated and was part of a movement towards a very, very profound philosophical change in Western thinking over the last 100 years or so. What Buber is saying there is, first of all, that when he says that the primary words are not isolated words but combined words, what he's saying is that there isn't something called the I that exists in isolation from others. So this is what we today call a kind of intersubjective position. And you see that in a lot of feminist therapies, people like Judith Jordan. You see that in multicultural therapies. You see that in relational variants of person-centered therapy, in the work of people like Peter Schmidt, in TA, Charlotte Sills, in Gestalt therapy, the Heisners. Across all these different therapies, people have adopted a intersubjective and relational perspective. And what that intersubjective position is one that fundamentally challenges the idea of an individual isolated self. If you look at theories like Rogers, to some extent Pearl's, some of the CBT ideas, Freud, they all have this idea of the person, the self, as this kind of billiard ball-like discrete monadic entity, which is, and we're all these kind of different people, and looking at each other on Zoom probably doesn't help because we're all in our little boxes. But what Buber is arguing here, and what intersubjectivists have suggested over the last century or so, is that actually we're not isolated, we're not separate beings, we are all fundamentally beings in relation, that our primary being is a being with others. And of course, you're probably most familiar with this in the work of people like Winnicott or Bowlby, attachment theories, which really emphasize the way that the infant comes into the world as part of a dyad. That our fundamental being, not just in a kind of, it's not just that we kind of come into the world and then we meet people, but that our fundamental being is not these kind of separate balls, but our fundamental being is an openness to others. We are immersed in the world. We are immersed in relationships. We're immersed in being with others. There aren't kind of hard, fixed, firm boundaries between me and you and others, with our communities, with our clients. There is no inner self, for instance, that is separate, discrete, isolated, cut off. If you compare it with something like, say, primal therapies, where there's a real focus on the kind of self and knowing the self, and a relational intersubjective position is much more that our boundaries as people are much more fuzzy, that we're in this world and we're in the world together. A lot of it in the 20th century in philosophers like Wittgenstein and Heidegger has been particularly around language. And the argument, and this was then developed by the postmodernists, the argument is that if we think in language, if we articulate and experience our world through language, and language is not something we create ourselves, but language is something that exists out there in the world that we're imbued with, then our very being has a kind of social, cultural form. Again, rather than being these separate entities, we are these social, cultural beings immersed in language and immersed with each other. And that has kind of implications about how we think about therapy, how we think about the clients, for instance. Does the client have something inside in themselves that they project onto us? Or are we then thinking more systemically? And there's people in the systemic field that have then drawn very much from Buber. I can't remember his name, Boskumi Nagy. Contextual therapy is one example. So Buber's saying here, this basic intersubjective position, that the primary words, the I is never separate from a context, that we are always in relation. Even if we're on our own, we have people in our heads, we have language, we're connected with others in this intersubjective nexus. But what he says very importantly here is that there's two different ways that these kind of primary positions, two different kind of primary positions of being, if you like, that Buber's talking about. And famously, this is the distinction he makes between the I thou and the I it. And I think it's so valuable, and I was going to say this at the beginning, but in one of the books Malcolm mentioned, actually I don't think Malcolm mentioned it, Existential Psychotherapy and Counselling, that I did a few years ago. There's a chapter kind of talking about Buber and relational foundations for integrative therapy. Because I think, as I want to suggest, Buber's concept of the I-thou stance is, I think, a wonderful description of what it means to be effective and human and respectful and valuing as a therapist. It's a basic stance, it doesn't mean that we won't do other things. It doesn't mean that we won't draw on lots of different ideas or systemic ideas or psychodynamic ideas, but this basic concept of the I-thou stance, as opposed to an I-it stance towards our clients, I think is a very powerful way of describing something of what, as therapists, we're trying to do. And he says here very powerfully, I think, this last sentence, that when we're in that I-thou relation with another, it's not just that our way of relating is different, it's that we're different. It's the two things go together, and that we're different in our being existentially. Existentialists are very interested in this question about being, and Buber's saying that our existential being changes as we have this I-thou or this I-it relationship. It's fundamentally different. So I want to talk about some of the kind of different elements of this I-thou and I-it relationship. And I'm going to kind of break it down a bit, but it's really important to remember that they're all kind of interconnected and they're kind of facets of a whole. So each stance is a kind of constellation of different ways of being, rather than separate bits, that they're fundamentally related to each other. Sorry if the text is a bit small. One of the first things that Buber says is that in the I-thou relationship, so in the I-it relationship, there's a kind of he uses the term experiencing, which is interesting, and I've never quite liked that, because phenomenologically, experiencing is a kind of positive thing, but he talks about experiencing the other in the I-it relationship, as in the other becomes something that we direct our attention to and becomes a thing for us. And if you remember very clearly, he says, sorry, just going back to that quote, he says that in the I-it relationship, the other can be a he or a she, but can replace it. And what he means by that is that in that I-it relationship, the other is essentially an it. Whether it's a person, it's still seen as an it, as an entity. So in that I-it relationship, there's a kind of distancing self from the other. The other becomes something other than us, of a different kind of being, rather than a kind of living, breathing subjectivity. They become something which we survey, we study, we measure, we observe. So if you think about, for instance, in psychotherapy, the use of outcome forms, or the use of diagnosis, or the use of assessment, I think Buber would see, and I say this as someone who's been very involved in outcome monitoring, but Buber would see that kind of monitoring with lots of measures as, you know, as a way of, by measuring the other, they become a thing. You know, we can say that they've got a core score of 23 or a PHQ score of 10, but by defining them in that particularist way, by pinning them down, they become this kind of object, and that we lose something of the relationship, that they become something apart from us that we're studying, and that the other becomes, he also talks about the way that kind of, when we're experiencing the other, rather than standing alongside them, we're kind of trying to do something to them. So maybe we're trying to make them happier, or we're trying to remove some form of distress, or was trying to help them see the world, or make them see the world in a particular way. But again, the other is an object of our agendas, or as he talks about it, our kind of aims, anticipations, and lusts. Doesn't particularly mean sexually, but just that they are something we're trying, that they're the focus of our directionality, the other, rather than in the I-thou relationship. And Buber says that when thou is spoken in the I-thou relationship, the speaker has no thing. He has indeed nothing, but he takes his stand in relation. So what Buber is describing here is that in the I-thou relationship, we're not looking at the other. They're not a thing for us to focus on, rather that we're standing alongside the other. Of course, this has a lot of resonances with Rogers and the concept of empathy. And you see in there's a dialogue between Rogers and Buber, and I think Carl Rogers was quite influenced by Buber, although a lot of his ideas had developed before. And there's a famous dialogue between the two of them. Maybe not quite as interesting as it could have been. Buber, to be fair, is a bit of an arse in it, I think you would say, and isn't quite as open. And Rogers is very sweet and kind of very respectful, and Buber's a little bit pompous and not very I-thou about it at all. But there you go, all those wonderful things, and not relating to Rogers very well. But when he talks about the I-thou, he talks about this kind of being alongside the other. He says, I do not experience the man to whom I say thou, but I take my stand in relation to him in the sanctity of the primary word. Only when I step out of it do I experience him once more. I'm sure you've had that experience in therapy when you're working really powerfully with a client, and it's like you're almost not aware of them because you're so in tune with them, you're so alongside them in that kind of state of what we've also called relational depth, just that being there. Where the other is not something apart from us, but is something next to us. Only when every means has collapsed does the meeting come about. So Buber is saying that we can only really meet the other when we stop wanting to try and do something to them, which I think is quite a powerful statement to think about as therapists. That if we're trying to implement a treatment plan, if we're trying to kind of cure in some way, that will never allow us to be in that I-thou stance, to be next to the other as a kind of in a deeply validating, respectful way. It's an objectifying relationship. Just to say, I'll mention this again later, but just to say, Buber's not saying, you know, we should be in an I-thou relationship all the time. He's not saying that that's the only way of being. He recognizes that we need to have both stances, and that sometimes we do need to break things down, and things like diagnosis and formulation and measures can all have their place. But I think where he was writing from, as with Heidegger, was this idea that if that's our only way of relating, or if a client, as therapists, if the only kind of relationship we have with people is an I-it relationship, and that we can't have that I-thou relationship. Or also, if you think about it in terms of kind of psychological distress, if our client's only relationship to the world is an I-it relationship, and that there isn't that relational depth with others, then, you know, there's problems. And I guess he was concerned, I don't think Buber would have been a big fan of mobile phones. I think he was concerned that the world was moving towards more and more of an I-it relationship, where our communications and putting things on Facebook, you know, to get hundreds and hundreds of followers or likes and things, everything becomes for a reason, you know, that it's motivated, that there's not that purity of being alongside another anymore. And I guess he was afraid, as I say, like Heidegger, that kind of humanism would get lost, that we move more and more towards a kind of technocratic world, where our clients, people, all our relationships became I-it, and the other became it to us, and where the deep spiritual possibilities between people became lost. Pornography, you know, is a really good example of the I-it relationship. And, you know, if you think about the way, certainly, you know, with young people today in the UK, I think, you know, you hear about so much from young people about how that's so much of the way they think about sex now, rather than intimacy, making love. That's the kind of thing I think that Buber's talking about that shift from the kind of I-thou to the I-it, where you're truly with another. So there's a kind of, in that experience in relationship, there's a sense of you're looking at the other, and whereas in the alongside relationship, it's more, whether it's with our clients, whether it's with other people, that capacity to stand alongside the other and have some sense of them as a subjectivity. I guess you could also link it to mentalization, Bateman and Fonagy, that idea of being able to recognize the intentionality, the directionality. Malcolm was mentioning my recent book on directionality, about the directionality of the other, that it's not just that our directionality is focused on the other, but also that our directionality recognizes directionality of others. So there's a kind of co-directionality, a being together. And that's what Daniel Stern, the developmental psychologist, talks about when he talks about moments of meeting, which is very much like relational depth, co-directionality. So that I-it relationship is very much about experiencing the other as a thing, an object, an entity. Von Weizsäcker, who's one of the existential psychiatrists very influenced by Buber, writes that the other is then thought of as a being of size, surface area, weight, function, desire, consciousness, characteristics, and capability of all sorts. So in that I-it relationship, the other becomes a depressive. Or they become, I remember at a conference once and people talking about borderline, a borderline, you know, rather than a person with borderline, a person who meets criteria. Well, it wouldn't even be borderline anymore, but emotionally unstable personality. You know, that diagnostic view, which loses the person. It's kind of like procrusting in bed, where the person becomes defined by their diagnosis, by equivalent to a kind of looking at an object and defining it by its kind of surface area or weight. And again, it's not suggesting that diagnosis doesn't have a place. What it's suggesting, though, is that if as clinicians, if as people, that's all we see when we work with others, is just that diagnosis. And it's very attractive, it's very seductive in many ways. There's 1,000,001 different forms out there, some of which I've contributed to myself, which we can use to kind of characterize and categorize our clients. But there's also something beyond that, and there's always something beyond that. What Levinas, the existential philosopher, who follows on from Buber, and is very interesting as well in his own right, talks about as the other, and like having that openness to the otherness of the client, not caging the client within the restrictions of our own worldview, our own tools. So the humanizing relationship, the I-thou relationship, means that the other is not a thing amongst things, that our clients are not entities, they're not objects that we talk about as objects, but that we see them as a kind of stream of humanity, a stream of experiencing, a stream of being, that the other is directional, as I was saying, as we are trying to meet and face their world in the best way that they know how. Doesn't mean that they always do the best thing, just as we don't always do the best thing, but I guess from a Rogerian perspective as well, that the other is striving to meet their world and to be in their world as a subject, not an object. I guess in some ways our kind of natural gaze on the other is as an object. We look at things as objects. But the I thou is a kind of step beyond that, is seeing the other as a subject. It's a subjective view of the other rather than an objective one. Related to that is then a kind of fragmentation that, and I think very importantly, that in the I-it relationship, it's very much about breaking the other down into parts. So we might break them down into dimensions on a personality or different parts of the psyche. If you think about transactional analysis with its parent, adult, child, which again can be very useful as a way of thinking about our clients. You know, I've done work myself about the idea of people having different selves, different modes of being, different ways of encountering their world. But when we're thinking about the I-thou relationship, there's a real kind of holistic quality to it. Something about taking the totality of the other. And I'm sure you know that kind of saying that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. It's something about being with the whole of the other in not just their parts, but also the interrelationship between those parts and that complex gestalt that defines uniquely what the other is, and kind of holding that wholeness, which is separate from that kind of analytical gaze. Analytical gaze is very powerful at kind of breaking down and seeing maybe the laws, the mechanisms, the entities, the bits within someone. But again, if we just see that, we lose the totality of the other. We lose the richness and the depth and the complexity of the other as the kind of subjective being that they are. I just wanted to read you, apart from, these are one of my favorite quotes from I Am Now, because hopefully it really conveys that sense of holism. So Buber's talking about tree. Interestingly, one of the questions around I Am Now is, can you have, you know, is it just other people you have an I-thou relationship with? What about nature? And I think Buber would be very open to the idea that also with nature we can have an I-thou relationship. There's also, interestingly, actually, he first talks about the I and the thou in relationship to a horse. So there's another question about cats and pets, and can you have an I-thou relationship with a pet? With my cat, you absolutely can't have an I-thou relationship. She's just terrible. She certainly doesn't have one with the mice that she's constantly killing. She's an absolute psychopath. I think it's okay to label her as a psychopath. We did the psychopathology checklist on her, and she absolutely failed. But other animals, other people's cats, I'm sure you can have an I-thou relationship. But he talks here about a tree. He says, I consider a tree. I can classify it in a species and study it as a type in its structure and mode of life. So he's talking here about what the I-it relationship like. And then he says, in this beautiful line here, I can subdue its actual presence and form so sternly that I recognize it only as an expression of law. You can imagine that, thinking about that in relation to psychotherapy and, like, say, diagnosis or categorization, where you subdue the actual presence and form of another so strongly that it only becomes recognized as an expression of a law and not the totality that it is. It says, I can dissipate it and perpetuate it in number in pure numerical relation. In all this, the tree remains my object, occupies space and time, and has its nature and constitution. And then he starts talking about what it would mean to sit in an I-thou way. He says, it can, however, also come about, if I have both will and grace, that in considering the tree, I become bound up in relation to it. And you can imagine that, you know, you're sitting there looking at a tree, and then there's a more of that kind of spiritual connection towards the tree. The tree is now no longer it. I have seized by the power of exclusiveness. I think what Buber means there is it's kind of by the uniqueness, the exclusiveness, that it is just that one tree. It's not an expression of treeness. It's not a kind of member of a particular category. It's that one tree, that beautiful tree that we're staring at, that we then become bound up in relation to that uniqueness, that unique tree. And Buber says to effect this, it is not necessary for me to give up any of the ways in which I consider the tree. So it's not about turning away from diagnosis or categorization. There is nothing from which I would have to turn my eyes away in order to see, and no knowledge that I would have to forget. Rather is everything, picture and movement, species and type, law and number, indivisibly united in this event. So it's allowing everything really to be manifest. It's not about subduing the itness of things. It's about holding them and the complexity in that holistic network. And it says everything belonging to the tree is in this. Its form and structure, its colors, a chemical composition, its intercourse with the elements and with the stars, all are present in a single whole. All are present in a single whole. And if you think about that in relationship to our clients, that holding of the totality of the client in their past and in their present, in their family, in their personality and their choices, in their loves and their hates, but holding that and being with the client in the totality of that unique complexity, and understanding the relationships with it, and understanding how it is to be in that space, and being alongside them in the space of that amazing, uniquely lived complexity, which everything can come into, you know. So it's not to say that sometimes it might be appropriate to talk about client, about having autistic traits, borderline, or, you know, that we wonder about this or that. And it's not certainly just about being non-directive or holding ourselves back. We'll come on to that. But it's about allowing those things to be there and not getting, I guess, so invested. And this is where it maybe links a bit to pluralism. It's about not getting so invested in any one gaze that reduces the form to something kind of pre-known. It's about allowing, as I'll come on to, allowing something new to emerge is where we come on to otherness. So in that I-thou relationship, there's also a part of that is around acknowledging the freedom of the other, experiencing the other as having choices and being directional, making movements. Whereas the I-it relationship is much more that the other is determined, that there's a kind of causality. Buber says causality is an unlimited reign in the world of it. When we're talking about kind of forces or mechanisms, or somebody's because of that, and this happened in their past, and that's made them like that, then that's moving more towards the world of it. And that's not to say that things in the past, you know, obviously things in our client's past can have a massive influence, but it's about understanding it as an influence rather than a determinant. Even with things like, you know, there's a lot of interest in trauma these days and working with clients with trauma, but people aren't their trauma. People are can be massively affected by their trauma, but there's also a person there who's trying to deal with the trauma, trying to deal with the aftermath of the trauma, trying to make choices in relation to that. And understanding that is something about that I-thou relationship is being with it. Buber says that in the I-it relationship, there's something about, very importantly, that we experience the other through predetermined schema. That's kind of another way of putting what I was saying before. It's like having those glasses, like darkened glasses, or those glasses that make everything look kind of multicolored, so that we impose on the other, we impose on our clients a particular narrative, a particular understanding of how they are the way they are. And of course, you know, our trainings in many ways really school us in that, whether it's person-centered or psychodynamic, CBT, Gestalt, TA, they all have particular narratives that we're trained in about why people are the way that they are. And those can be very powerful because, you know, we have an investment, reality is we have an investment in them. You know, if I've spent 5 years training as a person-centered therapist and believing that things are due to conditions of worth, it's difficult for me to kind of really acknowledge that maybe with a client that's not what's going on, that maybe it's more to do with dysfunctional cognition, something I don't know much about and is related to this horrible thing called CBT. And in many ways, you know, so integrative, the nice thing about integrative therapies is that it gives us a bit more openness. And maybe pluralism even more. We can maybe talk about that if people wanted to talk a bit about pluralism and integration and that links. But I think pluralism links to this very much in that for Buber in the I-thou relationship, it's about trying to allow otherness to emerge in the present. It's about being, Peter Schmidt in the person-centered field has written very beautifully about this, about allowing ourselves to be kind of touched and struck, affected by the uniqueness of the other. And what that means is like having a space in which we as the therapist have kind of unknown opennesses. We're open to things in the client that we maybe didn't expect or didn't imagine. And that we're not going in there with a kind of these fixed sunglasses, but we're taking our sunglasses off for long enough to allow ourselves to experience and sit in with the client and experience them in their totality. And again, that's not to say that's the only thing. We know from therapy that it can be really helpful for clients to hear our views on things and to understand our models. But clients also really wouldn't like, I think, to be boxed into that model. There needs to be that kind of flexibility, that openness, that appreciation of the uniqueness of the client. In a sense, that dialectic between the I and the I-thou, moving between maybe more of a structured way of doing things and seeing things to more of that openness and having that open position where we can really bear and we can tolerate and we can be with the client without models, or with those models, our assumptions, our biases, our agendas bracketed, put to one side, so that we can allow that uniqueness to emerge. Buber talks about in his paper on dialogue that the first part is a lot about armor and the way that we go around in the world wearing this armor, which kind of both protects us and restricts us, an armor which kind of defines how we are in the world. And the challenge as a therapist, I think, is to take that armor off and to relate to the client as one vulnerable human being to another. So there's something in the I-thou relationship about being with the uniqueness, the individuality of the client, without the client in the particular now. That relationship is exclusive. We saw that earlier. That it's not something which is prefigured and repeated endlessly. It's something which is unique, new, different, irreplaceable, inexchangeable with that particular human being in their particular context at that particular point in time, and being open to that kind of uniqueness. Buber says every real relationship in the world isn't exclusive. It's exclusive. That kind of differs from the I-it stance, which is about generalization. It's about laws. It's about knowing what is there in these kind of generalized laws where things are stripped of their complexity and their individuality, where they're experienced as a we remember it or as a I'll do this with it. Something formulaic, general, endlessly repetitive. I'm sure you know you've had that experience maybe with clients or other people in your life. People talking to you like they could be talking to anybody. They, at that kind of narrative level, they're telling you a narrative, but there's something kind of non-specific about it. It's like it's a story that they've told over and over again. And you probably, if you've had that experience, you'll know there's something about it that feels kind of disconnected. It doesn't quite feel like there's a connection between the two of you, because connection is something about the uniqueness of that relationship. It's about me talking to you. You know, if I was talking to a group, if I was talking to you as I might talk to a group of American psychotherapy researchers, or I might talk to my students, there would be a kind of a lack of individualization. You know, it's difficult to do, I guess, when you're talking to 99 people on Zoom, 98 people on Zoom. But there is something about the I-thou relationship, about the uniqueness of the other, and that kind of two-way openness to uniqueness, rather than, like, as I'm talking to you, I could go into a talk that I've done before, and some of this is things I've talked about before, but for me to try and keep a connection with you and to deepen a connection with you means allowing myself to kind of ad-libbing, maybe for want of a better word, is like talk about things that maybe as they come up to some extent, because it brings that relationship to you in the present. And of course, at the moment, at least, it's just a one-way talk, which is not particularly I thou. It's interesting also, I think, some of that more, where, if you think about some questions like where does that more formulaic talk come from, I'm sure a lot of it comes from anxiety. Certainly, I know the more, as somebody who used to be incredibly terrified of public speaking, I would have everything written down word for word because I was just so scared of getting it all wrong. And over the years, and particularly actually, I find online talking quite disinhibiting. I found it easier to relax. And then as I relax, I can improvise more. And I'm sure for many of our clients who are incredibly anxious, it's very hard to be in an I-thou relationship with someone, to let down those barriers and to be fully present to the unknown, to that unique individuality. There's a real sense of wanting to do things in a way that is known, because that feels safe and that feels much more careful. And you see that particularly in some of the things, developmental problems like autism, where I think part of that repetition is probably linked in with anxiety and fears about new and different things. Buber, very much like Rogers, talks about acceptance, confirming. He uses the word confirming, an act of love through which one acknowledges the other as one who exists in his own peculiar form and has the right to do so. Maurice Friedman has written a lot about kind of dialogical psychotherapy, translating Buber into psychotherapy. Worth a read. I think a lot of it you find is very close to Rogers, and he often makes the case that it's very different, and I'm not sure how much it is. There's a lot that is very close to Rogers, but acceptance the other in their wholeness, uniqueness, in their potentiality. Sometimes I think the difference between Rogers though is that for Buber, with his emphasis on kind of meeting and dialogue, there is something about in Buber very much about empathy and standing in the shoes of the other. But there's also something about meeting the other from one's own position. And, in Rogers, you could see that incongruence, but a lot of classical person-centered work is being in the world of the other and getting a sense of how that is. Buber says something which has always stuck with me, is that you can't have dialogue without otherness. That if you want to have dialogue, you have to have some kind of difference to bridge across. So that if you are, in the kind of classical Rogerian sense, standing in the shoes of the other, there's not really any dialogue. And I think clients sometimes experience that and get a bit frustrated with that in person-centered work, that, that there's such close reflections that there's nothing to kind of meet. It just becomes a kind of repetition of, and it's often very useful, but a repetition. So confirming is kind of accepting the other, but also something about from that place of otherness. And I guess acceptance from a place of otherness can often be more powerful than acceptance from your own place. It's somebody genuinely other accepting you. In terms of the person doing the relating, there's a few things that Buber also talks about. So in the I-it relationship, it's not just that we meet the other in a kind of fragmented way, but also that we meet as a fragmented being. That that it's only part of us, maybe our mind or our emotions, involved in that relationship. And what Buber says is that when we're in that I-thou relationship, that it's only something we can speak with the whole of our being. So it's not just meeting the holism of the other. And this is, for us as therapists, it means us as the whole being that we are, with our vulnerabilities, with our emotions, with our cognitions, with our perceptions, being there in the relationship as another human being. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily lots of self-disclosure. And actually, Buber very specifically says that I-thou relationship doesn't require a kind of splurging of everything that's within us. I think he would see that as not particularly I thou, but he would see it as that kind of fundamental stance of openness, an engagement with another where we're not kind of deliberately holding stuff back. Professional, of course, at the same time, but as a cognitive, affective, embodied whole. And I think generally we know from the psychotherapy research that that's what clients tend to like, is someone who's there as a person, professional, not overly disclosing, not massively disclosing, not spending loads of time at all talking about themselves, but just someone who's fairly kind of relaxed and there as a real person rather than pretending to be some kind of white-coated professional. So whereas in the I-it relationship, there's a kind of protectiveness that the other is, that we experience the other through this kind of schema, through our lens in a way that kind of confirms the world that we believe in. So, you know, we expect something and we project it onto the world, and lo and behold, then we see that. We expect, I don't know, depressives to be angry, and then we see when our depressed clients are angry, and that confirms to us that people who are depressed are angry. The I-thou relationship is a willingness to take risks, real risks, in the sense of a kind of real openness. Buber describes it as a perilous and unreliable encounter. The well-tried context is loosened and one's security shattered. And he says, the human being who emerges from the act of pure relation that so involves his being is now in his being something more that has grown in him, of which he did not know before and whose origin he is not rightly able to indicate. So in that I-thou relationship as a therapist, we change too. It's not just our clients that change, but we allow ourselves to be changed by the client in genuine ways that we can't predict or control. I guess in many ways the I-thou stance is one about loosening control, our control. It's about being openness to that otherness and being open to being changed all the time within a kind of professional frame that is so important to our work. In his later works, Buber kind of moves away from talking about the I-thou, I-it to monologue and dialogue. And this is something that I think is such a powerful term, the idea of dialogue. But dialogue is essentially, when he's talking about sometimes people talk about the I-thou relationship, and Buber doesn't actually talk about an I-thou relationship. He talks about stance, because he's describing what stance one person might hold to another. So it's still a little bit one person rather than two person. And in his later work, he talks more about dialogue. But dialogue is kind of two people in an I-thou stance towards each other. And that's where there's a kind of openness, what I've described in the relational depth work is kind of both receptivity to the other, but also then an expressivity. So both kind of deeply receiving our clients and really listening to them, but also being willing to open ourselves and express ourselves to clients. And that contrast with monologue, and Buber writes in his paper on Essay on Dialogue, he writes about how so much of what people call dialogue is really just monologue, is people talking to themselves. So that when you see these kind of, I don't know, YouTube celebrities talking about something, who are they talking to? You know, often it's to their own egos, their own needs. On Facebook, when people are telling stories, often it's not really reaching out or connecting with others. It's something about the self. He talks about, for instance, two or more men meeting in space speak each with himself in strangely tortuous and circuitous ways, and yet imagine they have escaped the torment of being thrown back on their own resources. So what he means there is that, you know, often people think that they're having a conversation with another, but if what they're doing is essentially thinking when the other's talking about what they're going to say next rather than listening, talking in a way, I mean, so much talk, if you really listen to talk, so much talk is about kind of validating oneself, kind of trying to make one seem better in the eyes of the other. So there's a kind of fantasy there, perhaps, for Buber that we've escaped our kind of own worlds, but actually, really, we're still within those boundaries rather than genuinely reaching out to something trans, individual and spiritual. It talks about, for instance, speechifying and rhetoric. Speechifying is when people don't really speak to one another, but imagine that there's a kind of court of appeal listening who's fascinated in them and is focused on them. It's a good question, you know, when you're working with your clients or just in conversation, really, just think about who is this other talking to? Who is the kind of referential other? Is it actually you? You know, when your clients are talking in your sessions, are they talking to you? Or are they talking to a parent figure? Are they talking to someone who's going to make the world, everything safe for them? Are they talking to someone who hates them? And I guess for Buber, dialogue is when the person we're talking to is actually the person we're talking to. It's not a kind of schema, a filter that makes us see someone. It's a breakthrough of otherness, which is really challenging. And some of the work I've done is kind of thinking about what are the conditions that are needed to allow that to happen. And I'm sure safety, and feeling safe, is a big one. This is an example of, I'll finish in a few minutes, but just this, one of the things about connection, also relational depth, is that often it happens without words. It doesn't need lots of words, and often it's more at the kind of silent depths, the emotional depths, that those connections happen. So this is from R.D. Laing. And he writes, I remember one occasion with a girl of 7 years old. She was brought along by her father because she had stopped talking. He brought her into my room and he left. She sat on the floor, crossed her legs and just sat there. Not particularly withdrawn, but certainly not looking as though she was interested to play or to have any conversation. She sat there like a sort of miniature Buddha, and I was sitting in my chair and I couldn't imagine how I might get to her. I asked if she'd like to talk and she had nothing to say. So I got off my chair and sat on the floor in front of her. There was no plan that I worked out, and she allowed me to touch the tip of her little finger with the tip of mine and gradually allowed me to touch the tips of all her fingers with the tips of mine. I allowed myself to become completely absorbed in the kinesthetic sensations at the tips of her 10 fingers. And for something like 40 minutes or so, nothing happened, except a gradually developing movement dance with the tips of her fingers. It became absolutely imperative that I not lose touch with the tips of any of her little fingers. And I imagine it began to feel as important to her as it did to me. After about 40 minutes, I opened my eyes. And as I opened my eyes, I found her eyes opening just at the same moment, without a word having been spoken. So we withdrew our fingers from each other and went back to my chair. I said to her, bring your dad along now, if that's all right with you. And she nodded. He told me later that as he was walking along the road with her towards his car, he turned to her and he said, what went on between you and Dr. Laing? She turned to him and said, it's none of your business. And these were the first words she'd spoken to for about 2 months. It's an interesting case. I'm not sure in the 2020s whether that kind of thing would be seen in a slightly different light, but people might be more cautious. But I think certainly when clients talk about moments of in-depth connection, when therapists talk about it, it's often not with a lot of words. It's that kind of emotional being with the other, because it is something about that. I mean, here Lang's talking about the kinesthetic, but it's something about that being as a whole person, and so much of our being is at that kind of embodied affective level, and that is often so important for that connection to happen. Just to kind of reiterate that Buber's not proposing that we can consistently relate to others in an I-thou way. You know, that it's inevitable that sometimes it will be more I-it, but it's something that we can experience moments of. And it's also not kind of saying that I-it is inherently negative, as I was saying, that it can help us kind of create a deeper encounter, but not to be so seduced by that technical manipulative way of experiencing the world that we forget that more contemplative, dialogical, relational possibility. Buber writes, without it, man cannot live, but he who lives with it alone is not a man. Just in terms of just finally, I think the therapeutic significance that, you know, therapy offers us an opportunity to re-establish with clients that I-thou relationship. And in many of the relational theories, there's the idea that clients have kind of lost that capacity to relate. And as both the evidence would show, and Buber and many others would argue, is that for many of our clients, the deep pain in their life is that isolation from others, that cut-offness, that fundamental loss of others, loss of community, loss of being in relation. That they don't have those moments of I-thou connection in their lives, that there's no one there with them who validates, recognizes, exists with them in a way that is fundamentally affirming and humanizing. So that as therapists, one of the things that we can do with our clients that is very powerful, whatever approach we come from, is to be with them there in that I-thou stance, and for them to experience that. And of course, you know, that's just one relationship in their life. And in many ways, I think the ultimate aim of therapy is that clients can experience that with other people. And we saw that, for instance, we did a big study of counselling in schools recently. And clients were saying exactly that, but by experiencing things with a therapist, that they could then experience that with their parents, like being open, feeling able to be open or trusting. And it's probably those relationships with others that are ultimately the really healing agent, if those can be transformed. But kind of like as a therapist, you can be a bridge. And for clients who have kind of lost hope of being in connection, and I've certainly worked in my time with a number of clients where really there's a hopelessness, and that hopelessness is a feeling that they will never have that deep connection with anyone, that no one will really know them. And that's a very painful place to be. I think as counselors, you know, we've kind of learned, we've trained to talk about what's going on as therapists, so that maybe we have that with people. But for a lot of people, either don't have or lose that experiencing of deep connections in their lives. And that's not just, as evidence shows, it's not just make people sad, it makes people very anxious, it can make people maybe even psychotic, just to have that kind of cut-offness from others. So I think that I-thou relationship can help us help somebody kind of find their way back into community, if you like. And also what it can do is it can form like a kind of basis for everything else we do, really. It's a kind of, you know, when we think about what the therapeutic relationship does, why is it important to have a good therapeutic relationship? Probably the answer, and it varies very much for different clients at different times, but probably part of it is about the healing power of a relationship itself, and that's what I was just talking about. And then part of it is also that creates the conditions in which we can do other things. We can make interpretations, we can give advice, we can make suggestions, we can help people develop insights. But having a good alliance, as the research shows, more than just about anything else, is pretty much essential for that to happen. And that's certainly what clients say in the work.